Back in World War I, although various German warships, occasionally in groups but most often operating alone, had caused a degree of disruption and loss to Allied shipping, they'd almost all been hunted down and destroyed in fairly short order. Unlike the wars of a century before, their high-performance power plants dramatically limited the time they could spend at sea through simple wear and tear, and as dedicated warships they were fairly difficult to disguise, and thus all of them were pretty much gone by mid-1915. Conversely, armed merchant cruisers, even if very hastily converted, had much longer lifespans, with some of them even surviving the entire war. This, combined with the post-World War I German Navy being significantly smaller than almost anyone they could realistically expect to fight, meant that the Kriegsmarine began drawing up plans in the 1930s to not only launch warship-based commerce raiding missions, but to also outfit a series of merchant vessels specifically designed as armed merchant raiders, or Hilfskreuzer. The greater survivability of these ships was largely down to two factors. Since they were actually merchant vessels, disguising themselves as slightly different merchant vessels was comparatively easy, and secondly, their power plants, whilst not especially fast, were designed for extreme reliability. These factors combined also meant that there was far more space available for supplies and other equipment than there would be in an equivalent warship. Into this program came the Steiermark, a fast freighter displacing just a little under 20,000 tons that was designed to move bulk cargo from Europe to Eastern Asia. Laid down in 1937 and launched in September 1938, she was still in the process of wrapping up her acceptance paperwork when World War II broke out in 1939. She was then taken in hand by the Kriegsmarine and conversion work began. A weapons array that on paper was worthy of a small light cruiser was then installed. 6 single 5.9-inch guns, a variety of 37mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns, 6 torpedo tubes made up of a pair of twin launchers mounted above the waterline and 2 single submerged tubes, plus 24 torpedoes, hundreds of mines, a small mine-laying boat, and a pair of Arado 196 float planes. The main guns, however, were both World War I in vintage and laid out sort of in World War I style, as only 2 of them were on the centerline, with the other 4 hidden within the hull, in pairs port and starboard with 1 pair forward and 1 pair aft, meaning that the total broadside was actually only 4 guns. As well as storing the boat and the aircraft in the aft cargo holds, the rest of the weaponry needed to be concealed either behind dropping panels in the hull or disguised as boxes, crates, and other merchantman-style deck cargo. Some weapons were even placed on hydraulic lifts that would allow them to be stored concealed below deck and then raised into a firing position when the time called for it. Other cargo holds were converted to house the crew, to keep prisoners, and to hold the additional supplies that the ship would need, as well as additional parts and supplies for U-boats that it might come across who might also need some extra provisions. Since it was anticipated that the ships would be at sea for months, possibly years, the accommodation for the sailors was far more generous than that were found on a typical warship of the era, and there were additional amenities like a small cinema installed, as well as sports equipment carried, and a decent library, all to keep morale up. Although the ship in its merchant form could be run with just over a dozen crew, the newly renamed Kormoran boasted a complement of 400. This was partially to allow them to man the newly installed weapon systems, and mostly to provide prize crews if they came across especially useful captured vessels. The ship was capable of 18 knots using a diesel-electric drive system, and she was commissioned in October 1940, sailing out on her first voyage 2 months later. Disguised as a Soviet freighter, she headed out into the Atlantic, where after a somewhat slow start she began to take prizes and sink some other ships in a gradual progression southwards, meeting up with and resupplying a number of U-boats and other Hilfskreuzer along the way, together with transferring prisoners and taking on new supplies from various supply vessels. By late April 1941, Kormoran was running out of Atlantic and so headed for the Indian Ocean, sinking or seizing several more ships, but having multiple plans to lay mines near various harbours frustrated by the apparent or actual presence of Allied warships in those areas. Late November 1941 found Kormoran near Australia, pretending to be a Dutch merchantman, when the light cruiser HMAS Sydney appeared over the horizon. Later testimony from the Kormoran's crew claims that after several attempts to pass herself off as the Straat Malacca, a Dutch vessel, Sydney pulled alongside at less than 2,000 yards. Ostensibly, Kormoran's crew would now hoist the Kriegsmarine ensign and open fire, crippling the cruiser, although not before Sydney inflicted enough damage to knock out the raiders' firefighting equipment and set several major fires. As the shattered cruiser limped away to the south, the Kormoran's crew abandoned ship as the fires were getting close to the mine stores. The fires reached the mines about half an hour after they left, which destroyed the ship. The crew who survived the battle, and the immediate aftermath of the evacuation, were then picked up over the next few days by various ships and brought back to Australia, where their accounts provide the only version of what happened on the 19th of November 1941, since none of Sydney's crew survived the aftermath of the battle. The wreck would eventually be rediscovered in 2008, about 2.5 kilometres down, and split in two by the explosion of her mines.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.